Important national security story is Victorian Senator James Paterson. Senator Paterson is the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and today that committee heard disturbing evidence about foreign actors and their potential to disrupt Australian critical infrastructure. Senator Paterson, tell us what you heard.
James, thank you very much for having me and for your interest in this important story. The Intelligence and Security Committee is currently conducting an inquiry into proposed new legislation on critical infrastructure. It updates existing legislation from 2018 by broadening the number of sectors covered and classified as critical infrastructure and giving government new powers to address particularly, but not only, cyber threats. This morning we had a panel of international and Australian cybersecurity experts. And we talked to them about the well-understood criminal threats in the cybersecurity realm, in particular ransomware, which is well covered in the media. But I also asked them to tell the committee about the less well-explored, less well-understood threats that come from state actors, malign foreign state actors. And they told the committee that it was possible, and I think some believe it's in fact likely, that there are already on our critical infrastructure networks, on systemically important companies in Australia, dormant foreign state actors effectively lying in wait to potentially do damage to a critical infrastructure asset as a prelude to a regional crisis with the motivation of disabling Australia and preventing us from coming to the aid of our friends and allies in a crisis. That is very sobering warning from some very eminent experts.
So what essentially you're saying is that, let's say, a regional actor, could be China, could be any country that wanted to basically take Australia offline. They might attack our electricity, our telecommunications, our water. It was the Colonial Pipeline hack that we saw in the U.S. an example of that, or was that more of a criminal thing, or is that kind of a prelude to what we might see in terms of how that disruption would play out in Australia?
Well, in fact, one of our experts from the United States, a former senior official in the Homeland Security Department, addressed that Colonial Pipeline attack specifically. And he said, although in that instance it was criminally motivated and criminal in nature, it is not at all difficult to imagine a state-based actor taking similar actions to disable a critical infrastructure like the supply of gas or oil or electricity or water, knowing that it would have enormous impact on a nation's ability to project power, to come to the aid of an ally or a friend in a regional crisis. That's a profoundly disturbing insight, but a very real one, and it demonstrates the need why Australian companies and businesses, particularly those in systemically important areas, must drastically lift the level of their cyber security and their resilience.
So just to be clear, does this foreshadow then a whole new way of war that is beyond, missiles and armies and tanks and helicopters, and is instead fought behind keyboards to take whole countries down essentially without firing a shot?
There's been a lot of discussion in recent years, James, about new Greyzone tactics or Greyzone areas. And although it's not an entirely new or novel military concept, it is one that's being expanded and tested every day. Greyzone tactics are the things which fall short of war, but which can do real and serious harm to a nation and its freedom to operate, its freedom to navigate, its freedom to make decisions for itself. It includes things like economic coercion, which we've seen at the moment from the Chinese Communist Party towards Australia, but it also includes cyber attacks and cyber intrusions. And that can range from espionage, just collecting information and intelligence, or, as these experts outlined today, lying in wait, dormant, on our systems to be activated at a time of our adversaries choosing to do us real harm.
Is one of the dangers of this that one of these actors, whether they're a country or criminals or whomever, because they're hiding behind keyboards, we might not actually know in the same way if it was a military attack who was responsible for it? Could that then add a whole nother layer of uncertainty to how we responded to that sort of attack?
Yes, that's a very live question, James. There's two issues here. One is, how do we know who's been behind it? And if we do know reasonably confidently ourselves, do we know to a level of confidence that we can publicly attribute it? Now, they're two different questions. It's quite often the case that it's fairly obvious to Australia and to our security officials who is behind these attacks. But in order to prove it, in order to go public with it and say we can attribute it to this country or this particular criminal entity even, there has to be a much higher degree of confidence and much more extensive evidence. So while our officials may have a reasonably good guess, sometimes it's difficult to prove it because these actors go to awful lengths to try and disguise themselves to obscure who is behind it, because it obviously allows them to get away with much more than they would otherwise be able to. It's not someone in a uniform marching down a street anymore.
Yeah, so Senator Paterson, just finally, very quickly, what does Australia need to do? Is this a government thing? Does the private sector also need to be investing more in their cyber defences? Does this require a whole-of-nation effort to protect ourselves from these kinds of future attacks and intrusions?
James, it relies on all of us, individual Australian citizens, government and industry working together to protect ourselves and our country. This bill before the Parliament right now is part of that. It will require companies to demonstrate that they have plans in place to protect themselves, and in extreme circumstances, it will give the power to the government to step in and assist a company to overcome a very serious cyber incident if they're unable to do so on their own. Industry needs to invest themselves in their resilience and their protections, and Australians need to do things like make sure you have a complex passphrase rather than a password. That you're using multi-factor authentication when you're logging into sensitive information, and that you protect your own privacy, because you can be a victim of criminal ransomware attack just as your companies can as well.
Senator Paterson, we're going to have to leave it there, but this will not be the last time, I'm sure, we talk about these topics. Thank you so much for this sobering report on this Friday afternoon.
Thanks, James.